Hello and welcome to Send Me. My name's Becky and I'm the founder of an organisation called One by One that seeks to end the vulnerable from being exploited. Through this series, I want to champion the call of God upon your life. And so today I want to look at something I've termed striking the ground. Passion is something that I love. I find it incredibly engaging. When people are passionate about what they do, I love it. It just draws me in. But equally, by the same token, people who aren't passionate, it can be so disengaging and actually quite discouraging to be around. I know sometimes I'll say to Josiah, my little boy, he's 10, and I'll say, okay, Josiah, you need to go clean your room. And I'll go in moments later. He's in the bedroom and I think he's working hard cleaning that room. I'll walk in moments later to see him sat playing a game. And meanwhile, all the clothes that were on the floor have now been rammed into the drawers. The drawers look like they are one more sock away from collapsing. Either that or the classic, hide it all under the bed, because if mum can't see it, then I've obviously put it away. And so many times I'm like, Josiah, I should have just done it myself. It would have been quicker for me to clean it up and I would have put it all away properly. Now I've got more problems because he's put his dirty socks back in with the clean socks and now I've got to sort out what's clean and what's dirty. I would have been quicker just doing it myself. Or the classic, if somebody's downstairs and I'm upstairs, I'll say, hey, can you put the kettle on for me? Only for moments later, I hear the metal sounding as it's starting to burn up and whoever put the kettle on forgot to check if there was water in the kettle before switching it on. And so now the metal's corroding away. See, there's something about people who do things half-heartedly that is so frustrating. I remember once, I used to be a nurse by background before I started running One by One. And there was this one particular nurse on the ward who just didn't particularly love her job, shall we say. And I always felt so sorry for any nurses that got her as their mentors. You see, as a student nurse, you would do half of your learning in the classroom, learning the theory of anatomy and physiology. But then you would do half of your training on the ward with other nurses and you would be assigned to a mentor. So you would help her do her job and that's how you would learn your practical skills on the job, as it were. And I remember this one nurse, bless her, she would just sit at the nurse's station all day and she would just moan about how we don't get paid enough or how the hours are too long or how the work is too hard. And she would sit at the desk all day, barely getting up to see her patients. Instead, she would send the student to go check on the patient while she sat there drinking her cup of tea. And I felt so sorry for the students because I'm pretty sure that by the end of every shift, they wanted to quit the job. It was just too much. Whereas people who are passionate about what they do, there's a joy that spills over from their work. They're passionate about it. They love it. They do it wholeheartedly. And those people are incredibly engaging to be around. Well, I want to share a scripture with you today of a king who, in a moment where it should have been critical and important for the nation's future, he had this half-hearted, ticking the box, tapping the ground moment where there was no passion engaged with it. And because of that, he lost victory for his nation's future. So if you've got your Bible, turn with me. I'm going to read a few verses from 2 Kings, chapter 13, and I'm going to read verses 14 down to verse 20. Then Elisha had become sick with the illness with which he would die. Then Jehoash, the king of Israel, came down to see him and wept over his face and said, "Oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen." And Elisha said to him, "Take a bow and some arrows." So he took himself a bow and some arrows. Then he said to the king, "Put your hand on the bow." So he put his hand on it, and Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. Then he said, "Open the east window." And so he opened it up. And Elisha said, "Shoot." So the king shot. And he said, "The hour of the Lord's deliverance and the hour of deliverance from Syria, for you must strike the Syrians at Aphek until you have destroyed them." Verse 18, then he said, "Take the arrows." So he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, "Strike the ground." So he struck 3 times and then stopped. And the man of God was angry with him and said, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck Syria until you had destroyed it. But now you will strike Syria only 3 times. Then Elisha died, and they buried him. Whew, quite the final moments right there. I remember when I first read that, I remember thinking, oh, Elisha, you've been quite harsh on the king there. I mean, the king didn't just tap the ground once. You didn't specify how many times he's to strike the ground. All you said was strike the ground. And, well, he didn't just strike it once or twice, but he struck it 3 times. When I first read that, I thought, oh, Elisha, you've been really harsh there. But the more I began to pray into it, I began to look at, well, why did the king stop? Why did he only strike 3 times and then stop? And I thought, well, one, maybe he thought he'd done enough. Maybe he actually thought the prophet would come alongside him and, pat him on the back saying, well done, good effort, you've done enough there to get by. Maybe he genuinely thought he'd done enough in that moment. Or secondly, maybe he considered that, well, I don't really understand what's going on here. What on earth is the relevance of tapping the ground? I don't understand this. And so he went along going through the motions, tapping the ground just to tick the boxes because this is what the crazy prophets told him to do. But, well, it seems a little bit silly to me, so I'll just go through the motions, as it were. Or thirdly, maybe he actually thought, well, 3 victories is enough. As a king, if you were to win 3 battles, well, that's not too bad on your CV. That's a decent track record. And maybe he thought, well, the 4th battle, that will be for somebody else. That's the future king's problem. I've dealt with my time and stood my ground in my time. Well, the future, that's somebody else's problem. That's not my worry. That's not for my concern. And so the king thought that he'd done enough. But in the reality, through tapping the ground and going through the motions, the king should have had a complete victory. But instead he settled for something very partial. I began to think about that in my life. I thought, have I gone through times where I thought I'd done enough? Did I think maybe that I'd failed at something, but actually I'd just quit too soon? I remember being out in Kenya, and we were there this particular day. We'd got a huge children's party going on, so it was a crazy busy day. And all of a sudden, one of my staff at the home came up to me and they said, Becky, we need you to go and pray for this lady who's dying. They didn't tell me any more about the situation, but I said, okay, yeah, no problem. So I left the team there with the kids doing all the activities and all the crazy stuff. And I went on into the village to pray with this woman who I'd been told was dying. Well, upon arriving, it was actually one of those really awkward moments where as I arrived, I discovered the woman who was dying, it was her husband's funeral that day. So I walk into this huge funeral procession. Now, the problem was the lady who was dying was HIV positive, and she'd actually given the virus to her husband and he died before her. Well, in Kenyan culture, when you get married, you go and live with your husband's family. So this lady had moved from everyone that she knew, everyone who loved her, everyone who was familiar to her. She'd moved and gone and lived with her now husband. So he was living on the same compound as his mother, as his siblings, as their nephews and nieces, this whole compound, but it was all belonging to her husband, Jonathan. Well, of course, I was there on the day of Jonathan's funeral. And so all of his family are gathered and they're all mourning his loss. Problem with grief is sometimes it can manifest itself in anger, and they decided that it was Beatrice's fault that Jonathan had died because she'd given him the virus that had ended his life. And so they were so angry at Beatrice. They left her in this one mud hut as she was literally just dying. She'd not eaten for days. She was incredibly weak, incredibly sick and needed help. But because they were so angry, they blamed her for Jonathan's death. Well, I remember meeting Beatrice and praying with her. I then managed to get her into hospital and get her lots of treatment that she needed. Sadly, however, Beatrice still passed away within several weeks of meeting her. The problem was she left behind 2 small children. And I remember going back on the following trip. I went back to see how the children are doing. They've just lost mum and dad, and I wanted to make sure they're okay. And I remember walking on the compound and seeing all the rest of Jonathan's family, including his nephews and nieces, all whom were well dressed, all of whom were a part of a school, so they're in school uniform, all of whom were getting regular meals. And yet sat to the side in the mud hut where I'd first met Beatrice were her 2 small children. They weren't dressed well. They weren't in a school, and they were sat sharing one bowl of porridge between them. I remember meeting them, and you could tell these kids were hungry. You could tell these kids were being neglected and not looked after. And I remember speaking to the family about, well, you know, if you don't want these kids, we'll happily take care of them. We do everything we can where possible to keep families together. You know, family is an institution invented by God, not man. And so we go to the nth degree, as it were, to try and keep families connected and together wherever we can. But in this particular situation, I saw two children who were now being held to blame for their father's death because they were the result of Beatrice and Jonathan being together. And now it's these kids' fault that Jonathan has passed away. And it was just this heartbreaking moment. And so I began to speak with the family of, well, if you don't want them, we'd be honoured to help raise them. And I remember talking with the family, and they said no, simply because if a child is raised in a children's home, as it were, that family is then frowned upon by the locals. You see, locals believe families should look after their own families, even when that's an extended family. So sometimes in Kenya, for families who are polygamous, I've met mothers who are raising their second wife's children and all kinds of stuff. But in this particular case, they didn't want us to have the children, but neither did they want the children. And it was this really awkward, tense time. And so trip after trip after trip, month after month after month, we would go and sit with the family and talk about these two small children who were neglected and not being looked after. Well, 18 months passed in total. And if I'm honest, I got to the stage of, I don't know what else to do, you know, other than going through the courts and taking these children by force. I don't know what else to do. But for one last time, I thought I'll send my social worker to go and sit and talk with the family. Just one last time. And then if it doesn't happen, I don't know what we'll do going forward. And so I did. I sent our social worker in, and he went in. Well, 18 months of talking with the family and checking in on these two small children. The grandmother finally turned and said, you know what? It's been your persistence that's actually shown me you really care about these kids. And so her heart began to soften, and she said, yes, please raise these children. Please give them an education. Please give them the regular meals, because we can't. And so we had the joy of taking these two small children in who are now in education, who are now getting regular meals, who are now well looked after. And it's an honour for Beatrice to raise her children well, to love on them and to give them everything that they deserve. But the truth is, I almost quit in that moment. I'd persisted again and again and again. I'd struck the ground, as it were, again and again, and nothing was happening. So I almost quit, and thank you, Jesus, that we tried one last time, because it was that final time of striking the ground that God began to move on the grandmother's heart, and she released these children into our care. But it began to make me wonder how many times in my life I thought I'd failed at something, but actually all I'd done was quit. I'd struck the ground 3 times and then stopped because, well, I thought I'd done enough. Just like the king, I thought I'd struck the ground enough times, but actually I'd held back. The truth is, a quiver in those days, a quiver is the bag where the arrows would sit. And an average quiver in those days would have actually held around 8, maybe up to 10 arrows in total. We know from the prophet Elisha's response, because he says you should have tapped at least 5 or 6 times. So from that, we can guess that the quiver had at least 5 or 6 arrows, but possibly even more. So when the king only took 3 to strike the ground, he'd literally only used half of his amount. The truth is, we can do the same in our lives. We are all gifted in different areas. We've got different talents that we can give. We've got time that we can give. We've got finances that we can give. And sometimes we'll do just enough to tick the boxes, just enough to show, I'm willing, here I am, send me, God. I'm coming to church every Sunday. I'm giving of my life to you, God. But are we like the king, where we tap the ground 3 times, but then we quit because we think we've done enough? And really, we've only done half a job. You see, my passion is that when I die, I've used every arrow in my quiver. I don't want to pass into eternity of having only given half of myself. I want to give everything that I have over to the King of Kings. I want my life to count for eternity. But in doing so, it means using every arrow in your quiver. Have you sometimes stopped and you thought you'd failed at something, but actually you just quit too soon? Just like the king, we can criticise the king and think that, oh, he was so lacklustre, he was so apathetic in such an important moment. But actually, we can do the same in our lives too. You see, what I see from this text right here is two things. I see that firstly, what is happening behind the scenes is critical to what happens publicly. You see, Jehoash comes and he's promised complete victory, but because he only strikes the ground 3 times, instead he has to settle for a partial victory. He comes and the battle isn't won on the battlefield. The battle is won or lost right there in the moment of striking the ground. You know, the king could have gone into battle with this incredible, mighty army, and he could have gone with his strongest men, but on that 4th battle, no matter what soldiers were with him, he would have still failed because he'd failed in the secret place. You know, you might want public victories, but if that's the case, then what's your private life like? What's your prayer life like? That battle was won and lost in the secret place, and it's the same in our lives too. What happens in the secret place will manifest itself in the public place. But are we like the king? I would strike the ground 3 times and then hold back. Well, I've given some of my arrows. I've done enough, right? And we hold back. What's your prayer life like? Because I promise you, if in the secret place, if in the private place, he's first and foremost in your life, then I promise in the victories publicly, he'll give you the victory to walk in. But just like the king, so often we can be held back. You know, do we sometimes slap a smile on for public, but really in the private, everything's against us? We're filled with so much anxiety and so much worry. I remember once hearing a story about a college professor who walked into a classroom holding a glass of water. And all the students were expecting the same old age question. Oh, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? Are you pessimistic or are you optimistic? And they were expecting the age-old question. But the university professor actually surprised them when he asked a very different question. He instead held the glass and he said, how heavy is this glass of water? Well, the students all looked amongst each other and the answers ranged from, well, maybe 7 ounce, maybe 10 ounce. I don't know. You know, they're trying to think of the weight of the glass and the weight of the water, and they're trying to come up with all these clever answers. And the professor smiled and he said, actually, you're all asking the wrong question. You need to ask, how long am I holding the glass of water for? You see, if I hold a glass of water for just a couple of minutes, well, it's not heavy at all. It weighs hardly anything. It's not a problem. But if I held this glass for about a day, my arm and my hand would begin to become numb. It would feel really heavy. It would feel weighty, and all the blood from my hand would begin to drain away as it becomes really painful. But actually, if I held this glass of water for several days, it would become incredibly painful. The truth is the same with anxiety and worry. If you're holding on to something, worries and challenges are going to come our way. No matter what we do in life, worries and challenges are going to come. But if you hold on to that for a moment, but then lay it at the feet of the King of Kings in prayers, we're okay. But if we hold on to our worries and we hold on to our concerns, all it's going to do is tire us down. All it's going to do is mean that we're not capable of striking the ground because we're too busy holding on to something that's actually holding us back. What's holding you back in your life from striking the ground? What's holding you back from really going forward with a yes cry, saying, here I am, send me? Or the worries that you're holding on to, that today you just need to lay down at the feet of the King of Kings. Or secondly, just like the king, have you quit too soon? Maybe there's been areas in your life where you've tried to step forward, but it's not quite worked out. Maybe like the king, we can step forward wholeheartedly doing something that makes sense to us. So Jehoash goes and visits Elisha. And it makes sense for a king to go and visit a dying prophet. That makes complete sense. So he'll go forward wholeheartedly and do that. But then the prophet asks him to do something. He asks him to firstly put his hand on the bow, and the king puts his hand on his hand. Now, this wasn't to offer strength to the king. Elisha's a dying prophet. But it was to signify that God was with him. He then tells him to strike an arrow through the eastern window. Now, this historically was often done anyway to represent, I'm projecting war upon you. And so the king could handle that. It's still a bit prophetic. He doesn't necessarily get it in terms of this is not really a battle plan, but I understand it, and it's not demanding too much of me. So okay, I'll do this. But then when the prophet asks him now a third thing, he asks him to strike the ground. You see, this doesn't make sense. He couldn't see the relevance between how tapping the ground in this secret place, visiting the prophet, how this would represent on the battlefield. He couldn't rationalize why this was logical, and so he did it half-heartedly. And sometimes we do that. With things that make sense to us, we go in and it makes sense, so we give our whole to it. Other times we think, well, it doesn't demand too much of me, so okay, I'll do it. But sometimes when God asks you to step out, who can I send? Who will go? For the people who say, here I am, send me, it's going to demand a wholehearted response. It's going to demand you giving every arrow within your quiver. And maybe you've struck the ground before and it's just not worked out. You know, maybe you've got a prodigal child and you think, well, God, you know, I raised my child well and I sent them to Sunday school, but they hit their teen years and they've gone off. Well, let me encourage you, strike the ground again. Don't give up on your prodigal son and your prodigal daughter. Strike the ground with every arrow that you've got to invest into their lives. Or maybe you've struck the ground through fasting. You know, Lord, I fasted that whole day in 1982. I've struck the ground. Let me tell you, keep on keeping on. Strike the ground with every arrow in your quiver, because you will see breakthrough. If you go through it wholeheartedly, God will deliver you. Maybe you think you've struck the ground through your prayer life. Let me tell you, your prayers are being answered, because your prayers are either changing your situation or they're changing you. Your prayers are being answered. Sometimes the answer doesn't look like what we expect it to look like, but strike the ground nonetheless. Don't hold back your arrows from God, but give him all that you are. Spurgeon, the great theologian, says this. He said, the interpretation of this symbolic act is simple enough. God will save. Deliverance is of the Lord, but it must be accomplished through human hands. Many shoot the 3 arrows and say, I'm saved, that's enough, I'll get to heaven. Oh, that they would carry on shooting until they get a heaven below. Have we quit too soon? Have we done enough? We've gone through the motions, we've ticked the boxes in our lives, but we've held something back because, well, we're just not sure. Maybe fear is the thing holding you back. You know, all fear does is set a boundary to your freedom. And what you're looking for is right on the other side of that fear. If you would just say, okay, here I am, send me. And sometimes the moving forward moments can be challenging, can be scary, because it's unknown. We don't know what God's asking of us. When God asked the prophet Isaiah, who will go for us? Isaiah had no idea what God was asking of him. But he threw himself wholeheartedly in the situation, saying, here I am, send me. And God did the rest. Is fear holding you back? Is fear making you hold on to some arrows for that rainy day? Well, Lord, I'll give you my 10th in my tithing, but I need to hold some finances back for me. Well, God, I'll give you one day of the week when I go to church on a Sunday for that whole hour, but, well, the rest of my time I need for me. Let me encourage you, strike the ground, my friend. If you really want to be a sent one who says, here I am, send me, it's going to demand every arrow in your quiver, that you will truly strike the ground in your life. With us working in Pakistan, we struck the ground once during the Dignity Project. Then we had to strike the ground again when we opened a safe house rescuing children out of brick factories. Then we struck the ground again when we started Sunday school in the brick factories. And then we're now having to continue striking the ground again when we're working right in the north of Pakistan, dealing with lots of Afghanistan refugees who are fleeing for their lives. It means striking the ground again and again and again. Don't quit too soon, my friend. Keep striking the ground in and through your life, because deliverance is of the Lord. Victory is yours, but it demands that you strike the ground with all that you have. I want to show this little video clip to you now, and it's a video of my little kids in Kenya, and it talks about because of you and the difference you can make in their lives. Watch this.
Blessed are those who give without interest, who offer themselves and expect nothing in return. Hallowed are the places of small sacrifices, where the thankless work is done.
Because of you, I have education.
Because of you, I have new life.
Because of you, I have a home.
Because of you, I have a family.
Because of you, I have food.
Because of you, I have a future.
Because of you, I have fun.
Because of you, I have health.
Because of you, I found Jesus.
Because of you, we are king's kids.
Because of you. You know, together we can really strike the ground. I want to ask for your help today. Maybe as you've watched this, you've thought, okay, well, how can I strike the ground in my life? What does that look like? Well, if you're able to sponsor one of our children, child sponsorship is £18 a month, that's $30. And you can be assigned to a particular child, whether that's one of our kids in Pakistan or one of the children like you just saw on the VT from Kenya. And you can write to your child, you can be a part of their life, you can be part of striking the ground to bring freedom to children around the world. If you would like more information about child sponsorship and becoming part of the One by One family, as it were, then please get in touch with us through the website, that's onebyone.net. We would love to have you come join us and be a part of striking the ground around the world to rescue the vulnerable. Our heart in One by One is to stop the vulnerable from being exploited. We want to do that through restorative care, through educational support, and through empowering sustainable living. And with your help, we can do that and prevent the vulnerable from being exploited around the world. So please check out the website and get in touch. Until then, I'll see you next week. God bless.